Hi, I'm Dave Maynard, and this is the last session in Prove to Me That God Exists, and this is probably going to be the longest session. We're going to talk about the sociological and the psychological arguments for God's existence. Now, this is going to be a little different than all the other ones. In all the other ones, I've presented evidence that you can draw a pretty accurate conclusion on that yes, God does exist. In here, the evidence is going to be a little more loosey-goosey. It's going to be a little more feeling-oriented. So just to let you know that. If God does exist and He does interact with His creation, you would expect Him to have a positive effect on people. I mean, the Bible does say God is a God of love. Yes, He's a God of justice, but He's also a God of mercy. While I'm aware that there are a fair number of people that have had a bad church experience, and there are also some people that just don't like the moral restraints that God has, or the Bible has put on humanity. But the positive effects He has had far outweigh the negative ones. And by that, let's examine some of them. And please be aware that I'm going to be summarizing a lot of this material from another class that I do called How Christianity Changed the World. So if you want more in-depth detail, please take that class. The psychological argument we'll start out with first. And the first thing is the transformed lives of the disciples and the apostles. At their leader's crucifixion, there was one disciple that showed up at his crucifixion, the Apostle John. The others were cowards. They were hiding. But yet, when the message of the resurrection came, they had to be convinced that He really did rise from the dead. They didn't believe it at first. But once they were convinced of it, they never doubted it again. And they went to their death, and in almost all cases, except the Apostle John, they died violent deaths, very violent. So these simple men and women, who most of them were just fishermen, they gave the world the highest ethical teaching it has ever known. They believed it, they preached it, even to their deaths. Now think of this. Think of the absurdity of a little band of cowards in an upper room one day. And a few days later, they were transformed into a group that no persecution could silence, that no torture could silence. And then attempting, as some people, and especially scholars, have done, to attribute this change to nothing more than, hey, the disciples just wanted to start their own religion. Really? Would you die for a lie, knowing it was a lie? Their lives had been transformed by Jesus Christ living in them. A second thing is the transformed lives of the early persecuted Christians. Now remember, from the time the church started at Pentecost in maybe 33 AD, until 313 AD, Christianity was illegal. And yes, there were periods where Christians really weren't persecuted, but there were also a fair number of periods where they were persecuted very violently. Roman emperors who persecuted these early Christians were Nero, Domitian, Trajan, Antonius Pius, Marcus Aurelius, yeah, that's the one in the movie Gladiator, Decius, Valerian, Diocletian, Maximian, and Galerian. They were fed to the lions. Nero, Emperor Nero, would have sexual orgies in his big garden, and I don't mean just like a little patch. I mean the stuff where, you know, the garden was like maybe several acres and a lot of the plants were really high. What he would do is he would have orgy parties in those gardens, And what he did to light to light it up, because he had them at night, he put Christians on sticks and doused them in oil and lit them. That was his light. Legs were broken off, or legs were cut off, legs were broken, the people were torn apart, their limbs were ripped apart by beasts in the arena. Some of the women were thrown into brothels to suffer shame before they were executed. I mean, we don't even know of the kind of persecution that they experienced. It was terrible. And yet, in spite of 3 centuries of persecutions, most of the Christians didn't attack their pagan enemies. They shed no blood but their own, and they died believing in Jesus. Were there some that repented? Yeah, sure, there were some, not many, but there were some. And I mean, you have that today. Not everybody who goes to church is a Christian. Also, and this is a big one, the transformed lives of 2,000 years of history, of people who have been separated by time and place, have claimed that their lives have been changed by one man, Jesus Christ. Other religions don't claim their Messiah is still living, or that he's coming back, or that he's changed their lives. They may say, well, we worship him, but I'm not aware of any of them that say, no, he changed me. People like James Clerk Maxwell, the scientist who discovered the laws of electromagnetism, Mitsuo Fujita, the Japanese pilot who led the attack on Pearl Harbor. After World War II, he became a Christian. Nicky Cruz, a gang leader in New York City. Literary giants like C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, the guy that wrote Lord of the Rings. Charles Dickens, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, George MacDonald. Skeptics like Lew Wallace, who authored the book Ben-Hur, the best-selling novel of the 19th century. Harriet Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, the second best-selling novel of the 19th century. The list goes on and on and on and on. The French Emperor Napoleon said he could not imagine having his soldiers die for him after he was dead. And yet that is what he observed with Christians. Yeah, he said, I can tell soldiers when I'm alive, I could tell them to go into battle and they'll die, but after I'm dead, I can't imagine that. And Christians in the 21st century are still being raped, tortured, maimed, and killed for their faith, especially in the Muslim world. In fact, there were more Christian martyrs in the 20th century than in all 19 centuries combined before that. Half, about 35 million of all Christians who have died for their faith did so in the 20th century alone. 2015 was the worst year ever for Christian martyrs. Now, since then, I'm not up on the recent figures, but as of 2015, that was the worst year ever for Christian martyrs. No other world religion has had such transformative power in people's lives. You can read about these in the book, the classic book, Fox's Book of Martyrs, or there are 2 editions of the book Jesus Freaks. And there are some incredible stories in that. And they're specific accounts of persecution. One that I read of, there was a young boy, and I forgot, it was somewhere in Africa, and he was playing in a field, and of course the stalks were really high, so him and a bunch of other kids were playing around in the field, and Muslim soldiers surrounded the field, and they basically said, if you come out and renounce your belief in Jesus and swear allegiance to Allah, we won't kill you, but if you don't, we will. And I don't know how many kids came out, but they then set the field on fire. One boy survived that fire. Well, more might have survived it, but this one boy they were interviewing survived it. He had burns third-degree burns over 70% of his body. He was 11. And one of the Christian leaders that went over there who interviewed him said, "Why did you do it? Why didn't you just take the easy way out?" And the little 11-year-old boy just looked at him quizzically like, "Why would I do that? Jesus is my Lord." I was teared up after reading that. There are so many examples of how people have come to know the Lord and how He's transformed their life. It's incredible. I encourage you to read either Fox's Book of Martyrs or specifically Jesus Freaks, because Jesus Freaks has some of the older testimonies in it, but it also has some recent ones. Interesting note, in the first century in Palestine, there were 10 messianic movements. In other words, 10 people claiming they were the Messiah. Jesus Christ was the only one that succeeded. All the other 9, the people died. Christianity has changed education. Christianity was the first world religion to educate male and female children alike, despite their economic or social status. Up to this point, a lot of the rich and elite or powerful people, their kids went to school, and it was usually only boys. And they were taught, but Christianity said, according to Galatians 3:28, they saw all people as equals. Male, female, whatever your economic status, if you wanted to go to school, you should be able to. No other country or religion before Christianity did this. In fact, our modern universities started out in monasteries in Europe. In America, 92% of all American universities before the Civil War were started by Christians or Christian denominations. Get this, colleges like Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, Princeton, Northwestern, Columbia, the University of California at Berkeley, the University of Kentucky, the University of Tennessee, overseas, Oxford, Cambridge, etc. All of those started out as Christian institutions. Louis Braille, who was influenced by his Christian father, invented the Braille system of raised dots so blind people could read the Bible that was done in Braille. The first thing missionaries do when they go to other nations and tribes and things like that, if the people can't read, they teach them to read. They educate them, because then they can read the Bible. And that's happened for 2,000 years. In fact, one of the Orthodox missionaries, when he went to the area that we now know as Russia, the people didn't have a written language, so he made up a language for them, and that's the Cyrillic language. That is the language that Russia uses today. And he made it up for them so they could read the Bible in their own language. Christianity has changed science. Alfred North Whitehead, the renowned British philosopher and mathematician of the early 1900s, said the origins of modern science required Christianity's insistence on the rationality of God. Christianity said if God is a rational being, and we believe He is, then may not humans who are made in His image also employ rational processes to study and investigate the world in which He created. The Christian Francis Bacon is credited with starting the modern scientific approach by using inductive reasoning. Up to this point, most scientists used deductive reasoning. And if you go further back, the ancients, like the ancient Romans and Greeks, they believed that the gods were part of it. And figuring out how the world worked, that was seen as kind of useless because it was invading the gods' realm, and the gods their gods were not always rational. For example, planets were seen as having intelligence and feelings. And that's what made him move. Christians saw themselves as having dominion over the world that God created, and that was from Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. Since God was a rational being and humans were rational, at least most of them were, then the laws of God, then the laws that God set up to run the universe would be rational also. Now, unfortunately, some Christians held to the Aristotelian method of deductive science, which really didn't get into that area. It really took the Protestant Reformation in the 15 and 1600s to blow the doors off of scientific investigation. In fact, from the mid-1400s, from the 1400s to the mid-1800s, every major scientist explained his motivation or explained his discovery in religious terms. The most prestigious scientific society in history, the Royal Society of London, was founded by Calvinist Christians in 1645, with 7 of the 10 founding members were Puritans. Hey, Puritans were not as serious and dour as we've led to believe. Get this, the founder of Scientific American magazine was a Christian. Isn't that a hoot? I mean, Scientific American is definitely not Christian now. Christian scientists like Nicholas Copernicus, Johann Kepler, Blaise Pascal, Isaac Newton, Alessandro Volta, Blaise Pascal, Isaac Newton, Andre Ampere, George Ohm, Michael Faraday, Gregory Mendel, Lord Kelvin, Joseph Lister. I mean, and many of the modern scientists that have received the Nobel Prize in our, since the 1900s. In fact, Christians make up about 1/3 of the world's population, but they make up over 65% of the Nobel Prize winners. Isn't that amazing? And yet some people think science and Christianity are at war. I won't get into that. I think we covered that in an earlier thing. Christianity changed charity and compassion. Now, this is going to be kind of hard to imagine, but if you could transfer yourself back to the Greco-Roman culture, and this is really hard to do because we've grown up in a Christian culture. Even if you're not a Christian, even if your parents aren't, you grew up in a Christian culture, at least in America. Human compassion among the ancients was very rare. Plato said that a poor man, usually a slave, who was no longer able to work because of sickness, he should be just left to die. The Roman philosopher Plautus said that, quote, "You do a beggar bad service by giving him food and drink. You lose what you give and prolong his life for more misery," end quote. Ooh. Remember that Roman spectators took great delight in seeing gladiators mauled or stabbed to death in the arena. And that practice took place over 600 years. That's almost 3 times as long as America has existed. In its extreme form, some cultures practiced human sacrifice, especially in the land of Canaan. And that's where Christianity grew up. So it was into this callous, compassionless culture that Christianity entered. Read Matthew chapter 25, verses 35, 36, and 45, and then read John's Gospel chapter 15, verse 13. Charity to orphans was another thing. Child abandonment was common in the ancient world. Either people had too many kids that they couldn't afford, and so they just let them out into the streets. Christians established orphanages for homeless children. No other culture or religion had done it. Christianity was the first. And they did this because they saw the biblical teachings that said every human life was precious in the sight of God. Charity to the aged. There is no historical evidence of homes for the aged in the years preceding Christianity. Christians established homes for the aged by the 5th century. Before that, many Christians took them into their homes and cared for them as they would of their own parents. Now, there were some cultures that did esteem their elders, but it didn't translate into caring for them when they were old, frail, and alone. For example, in the Eskimo culture, many years ago, it was common practice to let the aged, sick people slowly freeze to death. In certain cultures, India was one, for example, when the older man died, they would put him on a man-made raft and they'd put his possessions on there, and they would put his wife, who was still living, onto the raft, and they would start a fire on the raft and push it out into the ocean or the lake. So his wife would die also, because she wasn't considered worthy of living outside of her husband. Charity by American voluntary associations. In the 1940s, a German, Gunnar Murde, noted when he came to visit America, quote, "No country has as many cheerful givers as America," end quote. He attributed this to the influence from the churches. Now, the following organizations were largely influenced by Christians or by people who belonged to Christian churches, even if they weren't overtly Christian, like the fraternal benefit societies like the Lutheran Brotherhood, the Ukrainian National Association, service clubs like the Kiwanis, the Lions, the Optimists, the Rotary, the YMCA, the YWCA. YMCA is Young Men's Christian Association, YWCA, Young Women's Christian Association. Soup kitchens, rescue missions, Habitat for Humanity, homeless shelters, etc. All that was started by Christians. Child labor laws. A major tragedy of the Industrial Revolution was child labor exploitation. A lot of those kids wouldn't even go to school. They'd work in factories 12, 16 hours a day, and then they'd go home and basically sleep, and they were given dirt poor wages. People who greatly influenced governments to outlaw child labor were English Christians like William Wilberforce, Charles Dickens, Thomas Carlyle, and Anthony Cooper, also known as Lord Shaftesbury. And while child labor has effectively been outlawed in Christian Western countries, it's still widespread in many non-Christian, non-Western countries today, countries like China, Thailand, Bangladesh, Africa. So people who think that human charity and compassion existed as a result of just civilization, without the impetus and influence of Christianity, they're just plain wrong. George Grant says, as missionaries circled the globe, they started hospitals, they founded orphanages, they started rescue missions, they opened soup kitchens, they incorporated charitable societies, and they changed laws. They lived as if people mattered. End quote. Sympathy toward the poor is a concept that comes from Christianity. But the elite and the rich in the Greco-Roman culture, they despised Christians for this, for some of the very reasons I've given. And some of their famous philosophers, like Plato, said things like I just repeated to you. Incredible. Why don't we ever learn that in our history classes? Christians also started hospitals and healthcare. The Greco-Roman world, for all of the roads and the arenas they built and everything like that, there was a colossal void when it came to caring for the sick and dying. Because God loves everybody, Gospel of John chapter 3 verse 16, Christians cannot please God unless we love one another. In the Gospel of John chapter 15 verses 12 and 13, the early Christians rejected the inhumane treatment of the sick and the dying. They saw each person as having a redeemable soul, and so they needed to nurse and nurture each and every person, regardless of their physical condition and regardless of their social standing. Now, were there doctors in the ancient world? Yeah. Who did they mostly treat? They mostly treated either the rich and elite, or they treated soldiers. And even then, it was only soldiers of a certain rank. So saving physically frail people to the Greco-Roman culture, that was an affront. It violated their cultural norms. Seneca, a first-century Roman philosopher, many of you have heard of him, he's a big famous Roman philosopher, said, quote, "We drown children who are at birth weakly and abnormal," end quote. Doctors and hospitals for the common person didn't exist until Christians established them. In fact, nursing as a profession was started by Florence Nightingale, a Christian who was greatly influenced earlier in her life by a Christian doctor and his nurse. It's an amazing mystery that the Greeks and the Romans, who built these large temples in honor of their gods and goddesses, who fashioned statues of all sorts, who wrote a wide variety of literature. They built big arenas, they built aqueducts, they built great roads, some of which are still in existence. They never, ever built any hospitals for regular people. The American church historian Philip Schaff has said, quote, "The old Roman world was a world without charity," end quote. Christianity has changed labor and economic freedom. The Greco-Roman world really had a very low view of physical labor. Basically, it was only suitable for slaves or the lower class people. At one time, Athens, Greece, had 5 times as many slaves as citizens. And by the way, when you hear that Greece, and particularly Athens, started democracy, okay, you really have to stretch the definition of democracy to get that. They started democracy for male citizens. If you weren't a citizen, you couldn't vote. If you were a woman, you couldn't vote. If you were a slave, you couldn't vote. You had to be a citizen of a certain rank. I mean, you had to be a citizen, but you had to be a certain rank to be a citizen. The Roman philosopher Cicero, another famous philosopher, said, quote, "Vulgar are the means of livelihood of all hired workers whom we pay for mere manual labor," end quote. Christians assigned work honor and dignity for 3 reasons. 1, Jesus was a carpenter, and at that time it was considered a lowly profession. 2, Paul earned a living from a trade. He was a tent maker. And 3, they believed 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 verse 10 and Luke chapter 10 verse 7. Hence Christian, and check those out. Luke 10:7 says, "The worker is worthy of his wage," i.e., pay him a fair wage. So Christians saw work as a calling that was under the lordship of Christ. Colossians chapter 3, verses 17 and verses 23. The view of work being honorable set Christians apart from the prevailing view, but it also earned them derision because they prospered economically as a result of their strong work ethic, and other people were jealous of that. Now, in today's world, it's simply assumed that all workers deserve a fair wage for work that they perform, or I should say in today's westernized world. But until the Christian view of work came to be, that wasn't true at all. As a majority of the residents worked as slaves, and as a result, there wasn't much of a middle class in the Greco-Roman world. The middle class exploded due to the Christian work ethic, especially the Puritan work ethic of the 1600s. The Christian work ethic has been rightly credited with greatly reducing poverty and its byproduct, disease. As an example of this, after World War II, Japan intentionally adopted Western economic and industrial values that were largely the product of the Christian work ethic. But once the effects of the cause have become operative, they can be utilized apart from the original cause. So the Japanese didn't have to become Christians. They just saw what it did for America, and so they adopted that after World War II. In fact, one of the things that Admiral Yamamoto said when he was told they were going to attack Pearl Harbor is, he said, look, I'll come up with a plan if you want me to, but he said, you're going to awaken a sleeping giant. He said, their productive capacity is incredible. I've been there. I went to school there. I think he went to Harvard for a while. Christianity also changed property rights and individual freedom. For the most part, private property rights for the common man were non-existent in the ancient world. But private property rights are vital to people's freedom. They can't be separated. If you go to a country that doesn't have a lot of private property rights, the human rights or civil rights are going to be minimal there. I guarantee it. In Exodus chapter 20, verses 15 and 17, it says, you shall not steal and you shall not covet. Both of these commandments, which were part of the 10 Commandments, assume that the person has the right and the freedom to acquire, retain, and sell his property at his discretion. Matthew chapter 20, verse 15 also supports this. Jesus only spoke against the over-attachment to material things, never to their exclusion. Capitalism, or more accurately, free markets or free enterprise, is a byproduct of Christianity's value of spiritual freedom, the spiritual freedom we have in Christ, applied to our economic life and activities. And if you don't believe this, in countries where the free market is not permitted to operate, the gap between the rich and the poor is the widest. Exactly opposite of what you would expect. In fact, in the old Soviet Union or in communist countries now, the gap between the rich and the poor is the widest of ever. I know you hear a lot about that in America, and it's probably wider than it should be. It's nowhere near as wide as it is in these totalitarian dictatorships. Now, because of man's fallen nature, we may need to place some barriers on the free enterprise system because we're sinners. So you want to place some barriers, some restrictions, you just don't want too many. Is it coincidence that the greatest amount of freedom and economic prosperity exist in countries where Christianity has had a dominant presence? No, it's not. I know there are some countries, like Japan, they have some freedom and economic prosperity, but only because they duplicated what we had here in America, which was mainly due to the Protestant work ethic. Rabbi Daniel Lapin said, it's no accident that a capital or a free market has never arisen indigenously in any non-Christian country. And that's true. By giving dignity to work and accentuating the spirit of individual freedom, Christianity has produced profound economic effects. Even in nations today like Sweden or Norway or Finland, you say, well, those aren't Christian nations. Yeah, they were initially, and that's how they prospered. They got off into socialism, and that really affected them, and now they're kind of getting away from that. And it's funny because we're in the U.S., we're kind of tending more towards that. Christianity abolished slavery. Slavery is a common staple in almost every society that ever existed, including Africa, Arabia, Greece, Rome, and the American Indians long before Columbus came here. And it's not just black against white, it's just one group of people against another, or one tribe against another. With few exceptions, kings, pagan priests, and philosophers, they all approved of it. Slavery is, again, it's not just about whites enslaving blacks. It's one people enslaving another, one tribe enslaving another. And it exists in many parts of the world today, especially in Muslim nations, especially in the Sudan, where Muslims are enslaving Christians and others. Christianity was the first major world religion that was against slavery. And they were against it because of, well, a lot of scriptures, but specifically Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, where it said there is neither male nor female, slave or free, and a bunch of other things. We're all one in Christ Jesus. Paul's statement about this was beyond revolutionary for its day. It was ridiculously radical. It was unheard of in history. because of Christianity, slavery had pretty much become extinct in the 14th century in Europe. Unfortunately, it was revived by the British Empire's expansion in the 17th century, especially in the British colonies, including America. But William Wilberforce finally ended slavery in England in the 1800s because of his Christian convictions. He worked his entire life to convince his government to end slavery, and when they did, he passed away within 3 months. He felt his work had been done here on the earth. In America, most of the abolitionist movement in the North, it was made up of 2/3 of Christians and Christian ministers. And yes, there were some Christians who defended slavery in the South. This does not nullify the fact that most Christians were against it, and because of them, it ended in America. I will say this, the Southern Church, no Southern churches as denominations really spoke out in favor of slavery. They were just silent on the issue. And yes, there were some Southern pastors who supported it to their shame. But the abolitionist movement in the North was largely populated by Christians and Christian ministers. Slavery was first abolished in the Western world as a direct result of Christianity. And those who disagree with that, answer these questions. Was slavery first abolished in countries where Christianity had a major or a minor influence? Check it out. It was first abolished where Christianity had a major influence. Where slavery exists today, does Christianity have a major or minor influence in those countries? It has a minor influence. Thailand, Cambodia, the Muslim countries. And for those countries that still practice slavery, which religion or political system is in shape? I guarantee you it's not Christianity. Now there are some nations like Mexico where officially they don't believe in slavery, but there is a big black market for it. But Mexico, you could say it's Catholic, but let's face it, it's pretty nominal. Christianity also has elevated the sanctity of human life. Infanticide is the killing of newborn infants. Historical research shows that infanticide was common in many ancient cultures, the Greco-Roman world, India, China, Japan, Africa, as well as the North and South American Indians, among others. Throughout the centuries, Christians have never wavered in their condemnation of infanticide. In part, because of Matthew chapter 19, verse 14, they always called it what it really is, murder. That's a harsh word, but that's what infanticide is. The Roman Emperor Valentinian, very influenced by Bishop Basil of Caesarea in Cappadocia, formally outlawed it in 374 AD in the Roman Empire. The Greco-Roman culture, among many others, practiced child abandonment. And here's the thing, in either Greek or Roman literature can we find any guilt feelings over this practice? Any guilt feelings. Clement of Alexandria, a church father in the latter part of the 2nd century, condemned the Romans for protecting birds and other creatures better than its children. Christians did more than just condemn the practice. They often took these children into their homes and they raised them as their own. That's one reason why the early Roman church wasn't very rich. They were spending a lot of money and a lot of time on taking these kids that were abandoned and bringing them in and raising them as their own. The Roman Emperor Valentinian outlawed infanticide in 374 AD. That was also the same year he outlawed child abandonment. Christians saw child abandonment as a form of murder. Plato, Aristotle, Celsus, all of those ancient philosophers, they had no problem with abortion, the killing of the unborn. While there was a little opposition to it, specifically Hippocrates, who is supposedly the father of medicine, I think doctors still have to take the Hippocratic Oath. And in there, I believe, I don't know if the modern oath says this, but in the old Hippocratic Oath, it says, we won't kill the unborn, or something to that effect. But there was very little opposition to it. Plato said it should be done to stop overpopulation of the state. Oh my goodness. There are people that are saying that now. Most ancient cultures practiced abortion. The early church's opposition to abortion, infanticide, and child abandonment set apart Christians from pagan societies. And their opposition was a major factor in giving the Western world its high regard for human life at all stages in its development. Again, the Roman Emperor Valentinian outlawed abortion in the Roman Empire in 374 AD. Unfortunately, we have, in America, and many other Western civilizations, we have backslid from our values. And abortion is legal now. Very sad. Gladiators also fought not only other men, but they fought beasts also. Thousands of gladiators were slaughtered during the 600 years of the Games. And the Games were held throughout the Roman Empire. They just weren't at the Roman Colosseum. They were throughout the Roman Empire. The Emperor Trajan, who was emperor from 98 AD to 117 AD, celebrated his conquest of Dacia by hosting games that lasted 4 months. 4 months. And they included 10,000 gladiators with 10,000 beasts. Half of the gladiators, 5,000, died during the games. Many more died afterwards from their wounds. Emperor Titus inaugurated the Roman Colosseum in 80 AD with 5,000 animals being killed in one day, plus hundreds of gladiators lost their lives that day. Christians condemned and boycotted these games as murder. And they said it's against the 10 Commandments, and they referenced Exodus chapter 20, verse 13. Their opposition didn't go unnoticed. The Romans thought the Christians were being unpatriotic. In fact, they thought they were being atheists. Really, they thought they were being atheists because they weren't worshiping all the Roman gods. A Roman pagan is quoted as saying this, quote, "You do not go to our shows," that's the games, "you take no part in our processions, you shrink in horror from our sacred games." And those were the gladiatorial games, end quote. The historian W.E.H. Leakey, who was no friend to Christianity, states this, quote, "There is scarcely any single reform so important in the moral history of humanity as the suppression of the gladiatorial games, a feat that must be almost exclusively attributed to the Christian Church." The games were outlawed in the Roman Emperor in 404 AD. Christianity stopped child sacrifice. Where paganism rules, it's not uncommon to see human beings, especially the weakest humans, children, sacrificed to pagan gods. Children's sacrifices were common in places like Canaan, which is Palestine. If you read 1 Kings chapter 18, verses 16 through 40, 2 Kings chapter 16, verses 3, and chapter 21, verse 6, and Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 31. The pre-St. Patrick Irish sacrificed prisoners of war and newborns to the harvest gods. You want a better harvest this year? You got to sacrifice one of your kids. It was also common among the pagan Prussians and Lithuanians until the 14th century. The Aztecs and Mayans of South America also practiced child sacrifice. They didn't stop until they were conquered by the Spanish. Whether the human life was a fetus, an infant, or an adult, early Christians saw God as the creator of all human life. Job chapter 1, verse 21. Only he could give life, human life, and only he could take human life. Now, there were some things that God okayed. I think he okayed a just war concept. But outside of that, no, we're not to take human life. If we took a fellow human life, it was murder. This view that human life was sacred went totally against the prevailing Greco-Roman view. The Roman Emperor Tiberius, who ruled from 14 AD to 37 AD, he was the Roman Emperor when Christ was crucified. He loved to see tortured humans thrown into the sea. Emperor Caligula, who ruled from 37 to 41 AD, killed all who once served in his palace because he was paranoid that they were out to get him. He also dragged humans through the streets after they were tortured, and many times their bowels would be hanging out, and he'd be dragged. He would have them drugged through the streets. Christianity also elevated sexual morality. Roman writers like Juvenal, Catullus, Martial, and Ovid testify that sexual activity between men and women had become depraved long before the time Christians came around onto the scene. Adultery, fornication, homosexuality, sadism, orgies, and bestiality had become common. They were even illustrated on some household items like oil lamps, bowls, cups, vases. And yeah, their kids could see these items. So modesty was like nowhere to be found. Adultery was exclusively defined in terms of a woman's status, not the man's. Gee, how convenient. And it was a property violation. So a man, married or single, couldn't be accused of adultery. But a woman could because she was another man's wife, and adultery was a property offense punishable by death. Now, because of this, many married Roman women registered as temple prostitutes, so they were not exclusively seen as their husband's property, and then they could commit adultery without being punished. Because a temple prostitute, somebody would come to the temple and pay money to have sex, and that was considered holy, that was considered sacred. Into this culture, Christians came and said, sex should be between a man and a wife. And it's not an expression of property, it's an expression of mutual love and respect, not of self-serving, lustful gratification. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 3, and 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7 say that. They also believed that the sex act made them one flesh and required them to be faithful to each other throughout their life. That was contrary to the Greco-Roman view. They saw sex out marriage. So Christians saw sex outside of marriage as wrong and sinful. There was a 2nd century document that archaeologists have dug up that said they, meaning Christians, have a common table but not a common bed. Believers also saw marriage as a type of relationship between believers and God. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22 and 23. The next one is going to be very controversial, but homosexuality. Christians saw any sexual act outside of marriage or monogamy within marriage as sinful. Obviously, they weren't admired for rejecting the Romans' sexual immoralities. St. Augustine said in the 5th century that the Romans despised Christians because they opposed their unrestrained sexual lifestyle. Tertullian, a Christian father, said that the Romans so despised the Christians that they hated the name Christian. No other world religion elevated sexual morality to this degree, or even anywhere close to it. Christianity condemned all forms of homosexuality as being wrong and sinful and contrary to the way God made humans. Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 32, specifically verse 27, and Jude, verse 7, say that, but plus a lot of other. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 9, and others. How Christianity changed the status of women. They never teach this in history classes, but a Greek woman was not a Greek married woman was not allowed to leave the house without her husband or without his escort, which is usually a male slave. When her husband's male guests were present in the home, she wasn't allowed to be with them. She had to retire to her own part of the house with the children. But the husband could have his mistress be in the house, in this one room, and his mistress could accompany him to events outside his home. His mistress was really his companion and his sexual partner. Yes, his wife was his sexual partner, but his mistress was really his companion and sexual partner that he took outside the home. Girls didn't go to school. In fact, in many cultures throughout their lives, they weren't allowed to speak in public. Ooh, why didn't they teach that in history? Greek poets equated women with evil. It was the Greek myth of Pandora's box that blamed women for introducing evil into the world. Greek female infanticide, the killing of newborns, far exceeded that of male infanticide. Males were treasured. Females were not that treasured. A Roman woman, she was under, and this is a married woman, she was under the absolute legal control of her husband. He had ownership of her and all of her possessions. This was called the Roman law of manus. She couldn't divorce him, but he could divorce her at any time. She even lacked the right to tell her husband's slaves what to do. A husband could even kill his wife for a non-adulterous offense if he got the approval of an extended family tribunal. But if his wife committed adultery, the husband could kill her alone. He didn't need any approval. The low regard for women also showed itself in how they were treated sexually. Chastity, in the Christian sense, was almost unknown in heathen societies. Women were slaves to men's lustful passions. Greco-Roman women were often temple prostitutes, like the temple of Aphrodite or the temple of Diana. Pagan gods had very low standards with regards to women and sexuality. It was considered a religious duty of yours to go to the temple and pay money to the temple to have sex with one of their temple prostitutes. And that's a major way that they financed the temple. Greeks and Romans had their mistresses, but they weren't allowed to marry more than one woman. But most other ancient societies, especially in the Middle East, they allowed and encouraged polygamy. And it's funny, it was always polygamy, not polyandry. Polygamy is one man with several wives. It was never or hardly ever one woman with several husbands. Isn't that interesting? To a large extent, Christianity stopped this. But it still exists in many non-Christian nations today, especially in Muslim nations. Because of Jesus and his teachings, women, especially in the West, enjoy more privileges and rights than at any other time in world history. And it's all because of Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, where women were treated as equals to men. In 374 AD, the Roman Emperor Valentinian repealed the 1,000-year-old laws against women. And he did it because of what the Bible said. Lastly, Christianity has had an incredible impact on common words, symbols, expressions, sayings. It's had an incredible impact on art, architecture, had a really incredible impact on music, the literary world, and political freedom. For specific examples of these, take our class, How Christianity Changed the World. I've also listed several, specifically 3 book references for you, and then 4 website references that go over all of this. So that's it for this session and for the class, Prove to Me That God Exists. I think if you take all of these things together, take the preponderance of the evidence, what conclusion does it lead you to? I think beyond a reasonable doubt, maybe not beyond any doubt, but beyond a reasonable doubt, it leads you to the conclusion that yes, there is a God, and He is the God of the Bible. And yes, the Bible is God's inspired word to humanity. And yes, Jesus is the only way to be reconciled to God. By inviting Him into your life to forgive your imperfections, your sins, you can have this new life. Your life will change in the here and now, and it will change in the hereafter for all eternity. I hope this class has been a blessing for you. It's been a blessing for me to put it all together. It's really strengthened my faith. Not that it was weak, but it has just made it so much stronger, and I have such a firmer foundation for belief in God. Because I'll be honest, when the tough time comes, not if, but when the tough time comes, it's good to have that firm foundation where you know beyond the reasonable doubt that God exists, that He's the God of the Bible, that He's Jesus, and that He wants you to come into a relationship to Him. Into a relationship with Him. So, for those of you that have made it all the way through, thank you for making it through, and I hope it blesses you as much as it's blessed me. Goodbye.